Gurmagat, Kirlik, and win on wind is obviously what I think we all look to achieve. I do welcome the opportunity to speak on this motion on energy, and I thank the proposers for giving us the opportunity to debate this hugely important issue. And clearly we are in an energy crisis. Indeed, we're in an energy crisis that is accompanied by other crises, the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, and of course the existential climate emergency. And all of these crises, this poly-crisis situation we are in, exacerbated by Russia's brutal war in Ukraine. And I suppose as we debate energy here in a relatively well-heated chamber, I think we might all reflect on what the citizens of Ukraine are enduring now under the hideous Russian bombardment, and in particular the absolutely horrific and illegal targeting of civilian energy infrastructure in Ukraine by Russia. And to hear Ukrainians speaking about the absolute absence of heat, of energy, of light in 21st century Europe is appalling to hear. So I think that does put this in perspective. But you know, here in Ireland, clearly we do also have huge difficulties with energy. We have a broken energy system resulting from an over-reliance on the market to deliver, on an undue liberalisation of the market, and on the lack of state investment in energy in energy infrastructure. And that is a huge issue. And I want to address a few of the points that are raised in the motion which highlight this difficulty and this legacy of lack of planning for energy infrastructure. But I want to start, Minister, by highlighting just how much difficulty has been caused for our own citizens, for our own people here in Ireland, residents and citizens across the country who are facing such huge hikes in energy bills. I just heard this week from one constituent of mine who's living in an apartment in Dublin city centre, a 110-metre square apartment. She lives with her husband and 2 children. And she has just been, and they haven't had the heating on. They're looking to save on energy costs and to do their bit in, also on carbon emissions. And yet they have just been landed with a €1,300 gas bill for the last 2 months. €1,300, because they live in a block of apartments, 60 apartments, and so their energy provider tells them they're being charged at commercial rates, even though they haven't had their own heating on. And that's the sort of reality that's facing so many households and so many families across the country with these exorbitant, as she described it to me, an exorbitant energy bill. And that's why we do need to look at radical and constructive and creative measures to address energy costs while meeting our vital climate emission targets. And I want to, as I say, highlight a few aspects that are raised in this important motion. First, the point of data centre connections. And I know we have debated this in this House already extensively. The huge burden on our energy system that is represented by data centres, in particular, the projected burden on the energy system from the 8 data centre connections, 8 new centre connections planned in the next 2 years. And we in Labour support a moratorium on new connections, and indeed we see very clear data from EirGrid. The system can barely manage even the current demand. The day for the highest energy consumption was this week, so we do need to see radical action from government on this. The motion also looks at issues around transport, and I think this is hugely important. We know that we know that there are real concerns that government policy is looking to rely overly on a switch to electric vehicles rather than a switch away from car use and private car use altogether. The Climate Change Advisory Council has called for swift and decisive action on this, and we must see therefore a much more priority on a move away from private cars altogether and a move to public transport, to encouraging greater use of cycling and of active travel. And that's why for Labour our flagship climate measure in our Budget 2023 proposal was the introduction, even for a 6-month trial period, of a €9 monthly climate ticket offering unlimited access to public transport across Ireland, modelled on the German scheme. And based on that example, and looking at what was generated through public transport fare revenue over 2019, we costed that proposal at €300 million for 6 months through the winter up until the end of March. And I'm appealing to you, Minister, to consider this as a proposal, albeit for next year now, because we know that in Germany over 3 months the scheme saved 1.8 million tonnes of CO2 emissions, equivalent to the annual output from 300 388,000 vehicles, and in Ireland the equivalent of taking 23,000 cars off the road, and also enabling a saving in costs of transport for so many people, so many households and families, and that would be hugely welcome in the context of those rising energy bills I've described. The motion also looks at measures around nationalising our energy infrastructure. And again, we in Labour have already called on government on a number of occasions now to consider nationalising Corrib at a minimum, to start with nationalising the field that is producing gas here in Ireland, producing about 25% on some estimates of our gas supply, and yet where we're seeing price being set by in an international context, we've called for temporary nationalisation so that the price we would pay for this domestic produced gas supply would be set at the cost of production plus a margin for the operator, rather than the much higher international market prices paid at present. And we know government has the power to do this through laws put in place through the oil crisis of the 1970s. And again, this could result in a significant reduction in cost for again, a significant portion of our energy inputs. The motion also calls for establishment of a state construction company to directly retrofit homes, and we very much welcome this proposal for Labour, because again, in addition to the energy crisis and over-reliance on the market and what that has caused, we've seen really, the very, very seriously negative impacts of an over-reliance on the private sector when it comes to housing in this country. And we've spoken about this again extensively in this House, most recently last night, where my colleague Deputy Jed Nash put forward Labour's opposition to government housing policy, and indeed where I yesterday questioned the Taoiseach on why we're not seeing a much greater state investment in delivery of public and affordable housing. We've seen private construction taking over, and yet becoming increasingly precarious. We've seen private sector resources being directed towards buildings such as hotels and office blocks rather than towards housing and towards residential accommodation. Only around a quarter of construction workers, as we understand, are now involved in residential building, and this is at a time when we have over 11,000 people on the housing list, with an extraordinary level of homelessness across the country. So clearly the government's reliance on the private construction sector to provide an adequate supply of social and affordable housing has failed, and it has caused immense hardship and distress across the country. We employ tens of thousands of teachers and nurses to ensure our fundamental needs in healthcare and in education are met, yet our need and right to warm and adequate housing is treated differently. So a state construction company could really address this difficulty and could resolve many issues around housing delivery, but also around workers' rights and indeed around meeting climate targets if we saw the work being channelled into retrofitting. And if I could finish, Minister, by referring to a project in my own constituency, the construction skills programme that's being run by the St Andrews Resource Centre in Pearse Street in conjunction with Dublin Port, in which we've seen a really important upskilling of people off the long-term unemployed register, upskilling so that people can take part in construction and that we can meet our labour skills shortage in the construction sector.
Deputy Jennifer